Welcome to a journey through 8 spine-chilling real-life stories, each one more terrifying than the last. Today, we'll explore the dark secrets hidden within cabins, where unimaginable horrors await. Our first story takes us deep into the woods, where a teenager and his 2 friends decide to spend the summer at his grandfather's old cabin. But what begins as a fun escape soon spirals into a nightmare when they discover an unexpected and horrifying presence lurking in the crawlspace beneath them. Stay with us until the end, because you won't want to miss any of these eerie tales. And before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. What city or country are you in right now? The cabin's dark secret, terror in the crawlspace. The old cabin had been a family treasure for generations, nestled deep in the woods where the outside world seemed a distant memory. Jake, a teenager with fond memories of summers spent there, had always thought of it as a safe haven, a place where the stresses of life melted away in the quiet of nature. But as Jake grew older, the visits to the cabin became less frequent, and eventually, it was left to the elements, its once sturdy walls now worn and weathered. This summer, however, Jake decided to return to the cabin, bringing along his 2 best friends, Mark and Sam. They were all looking for an adventure, a break from the monotony of city life, and the remote cabin seemed like the perfect place to find it. The boys packed their bags with excitement, ready to spend their days fishing, hiking, and exploring the deep woods that surrounded the cabin. As they arrived, the cabin stood as a silent sentinel in the clearing, its wooden walls covered in a thin layer of moss, the windows clouded with dust. Despite its aged appearance, it still held a certain charm, a reminder of the simpler times Jake had spent there as a child. The boys quickly unpacked and settled in, eager to make the most of their time away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The first few days passed without incident. The boys spent their time exploring the woods, swimming in the nearby lake, and enjoying the freedom that came with being so far from civilization. The isolation was exhilarating, and they reveled in the peace and quiet, far from the noise of their everyday lives. But as the days turned into nights, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with small things, Mark's flashlight going missing, only to be found in the exact spot where he was sure he had left it, or the sound of footsteps echoing through the cabin late at night when all 3 boys were accounted for. At first, they laughed it off, blaming their nerves or the natural creaks and groans of an old building settling into the night. But as the occurrences became more frequent, their laughter turned into uneasy silence. One evening, after a long day of exploring, the boys decided to turn in early. The sun had just set, leaving the cabin in a blanket of darkness, with only the flickering light of the fireplace to illuminate the room. The air inside felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in around them. As they lay in their sleeping bags, the silence of the woods outside was broken by a loud thud, followed by a slow, scraping sound coming from beneath the floorboards. The noise was unmistakable, something was moving in the crawlspace under the cabin. Jake sat up, his heart pounding in his chest, as he strained to hear more. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was down there was making its way directly beneath them. Mark and Sam exchanged nervous glances, their fear evident in the dim light. Unable to ignore the sound any longer, Jake grabbed his flashlight and gestured for the others to follow him. The 3 boys crept toward the narrow door that led to the crawlspace, the one that had always remained locked. But tonight, it was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning them inside. Jake hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to leave whatever was down there alone. But curiosity got the better of him. He slowly pushed the door open, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the dusty, cobweb-covered space beneath the cabin. At first, there was nothing, just the wooden beams and old, forgotten boxes left behind by his grandfather. But as Jake moved the light across the space, he froze. In the far corner, something shifted. A figure, hunched and still, its eyes glinting in the darkness. It was a moment before Jake realized that those eyes were watching him, unblinking and cold. He stumbled back, the door slamming shut behind him. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light. It was something far more sinister, something that had been waiting in the shadows beneath the cabin. The crawlspace door was firmly shut, but the sense of unease lingered long after Jake and his friends retreated back into the main room of the cabin. The encounter had left them shaken, their minds racing with questions they couldn't begin to answer. The figure in the shadows, the unblinking eyes, it wasn't something any of them had been prepared for. The cabin, once a place of refuge and comfort, had taken on a menacing air, its familiar walls now seeming to close in around them. The boys huddled together, their voices hushed as they tried to make sense of what they had seen. Sam was the first to break the silence, suggesting that it was probably just an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or some other creature that had taken shelter under the cabin. But the explanation felt hollow, even as he spoke the words. The look in Jake's eyes, the fear that still lingered in the air, told them all that what they had seen was no ordinary animal. Mark, always the more skeptical of the group, tried to downplay the situation. He suggested that they had been seeing things, their imaginations running wild after days of isolation in the woods. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice, the way his hands shook slightly as he reached for the firewood. The unease was palpable, settling over them like a heavy blanket that they couldn't shake off. Despite their attempts to brush off the incident, none of them could bring themselves to go near the crawlspace again. The door remained closed, the dark space beneath the cabin a forbidden zone that they all silently agreed to avoid. The cabin, once a place of laughter and light, was now filled with an oppressive silence that weighed on them with every passing hour. As the night wore on, the temperature inside the cabin seemed to drop. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its flames casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. The boys sat close to the fire, their backs to the crawlspace door, as if by not looking at it, they could pretend it wasn't there. But the memory of those eyes in the darkness was impossible to escape. Sleep did not come easily that night. Jake lay awake, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and doubt. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind outside, set his nerves on edge. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. In the early hours of the morning, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the dusty windows, Jake heard it again, the slow, deliberate scraping from beneath the floorboards. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He held his breath, straining to hear more, but the sound soon faded, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. When he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with shadows and whispers, of unseen figures lurking just out of sight. He awoke with a start, the memory of those cold, unblinking eyes burned into his mind. The cabin was bathed in the pale light of morning, but the sense of dread had not lifted. If anything, it had grown stronger, more insistent. As the day wore on, the boys went through the motions of their usual routine, gathering firewood, fishing in the lake, exploring the woods, but the carefree spirit of their adventure was gone. The laughter that had once filled the cabin was replaced by uneasy silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, haunted by what they had seen. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had disturbed something ancient and malevolent, something that had been lying in wait beneath the cabin. The questions continued to swirl in his mind, but there were no answers to be found, only the growing certainty that whatever was down there wasn't finished with them yet. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, a constant undercurrent of fear that tainted every moment of their stay. By the third day, the boys were on edge, their nerves frayed by the eerie occurrences that seemed to intensify with each passing hour. The sounds from the crawlspace had grown more frequent, the scraping and thudding now an almost constant reminder that they were not alone. Despite their attempts to ignore it, the presence beneath the cabin was impossible to forget. Jake couldn't take it anymore. The fear gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night and leaving him jumpy during the day. He knew they had to do something, anything, to confront whatever was hiding beneath them. They couldn't just sit and wait for something terrible to happen. With a resolve born out of desperation, he decided to return to the crawlspace, this time determined to uncover the truth. Mark and Sam were hesitant, their faces pale with anxiety as Jake explained his plan. They argued that it was too dangerous, that they should pack up and leave the cabin altogether. But Jake was adamant. He couldn't leave without knowing what was down there, without confronting the source of their terror. Reluctantly, Mark and Sam agreed to help, though the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. The three of them armed themselves with whatever they could find, a rusty crowbar, an old hunting knife, and a flashlight, and made their way to the crawlspace door. The cabin was deathly silent, the only sound the faint creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the handle, the memory of those unblinking eyes flashing in his mind. He slowly pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as the darkness of the crawlspace yawned before them. The beam of the flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing the same dusty, cobweb-covered space they had seen before. But this time, there was something different. In the corner where Jake had seen the figure, the ground was disturbed, as if something had been digging there. Jake motioned for the others to follow as he cautiously crawled inside, the dirt floor cold beneath his hands. The space was cramped, the low ceiling forcing them to move on their hands and knees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the silence was oppressive, pressing down on them from all sides. As they approached the disturbed area, Jake's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. He held his breath, the fear almost suffocating as he reached out to touch the loose dirt. His fingers brushed against something hard, something that wasn't stone or wood. He hesitated, then carefully brushed away more of the dirt, revealing the object hidden beneath. It was a small, metal box, rusted and covered in grime. The box was old, its edges worn smooth by time. Jake's hands shook as he pried it open, the lid creaking on its rusty hinges. Inside, he found a collection of papers, yellowed with age, and a few small trinkets, a faded photograph, a locket, and an old key. But it was the papers that caught his attention. The writing was barely legible, the ink faded and smudged, but Jake could make out a few words. The papers were letters, written in a shaky hand, describing strange occurrences in the cabin, voices in the night, objects moving on their own, and a presence that watched from the shadows. As Jake read through the letters, a chilling realization dawned on him. The letters were written by his grandfather, years before Jake was even born. His grandfather had experienced the same terror, the same sense of being watched, and had hidden the letters in the crawlspace, perhaps in the hope that the cabin's dark secret would remain buried. But now it was too late. They had disturbed the crawlspace, unearthed the past, and whatever was down there was awake. Suddenly, the temperature in the crawlspace plummeted, the air turning icy cold. The flashlight flickered again, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through Jake as he fumbled for the flashlight, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But before he could find it, the scraping sound returned, louder and more insistent, as if something was moving toward them. Jake's blood ran cold as the realization hit him, they weren't alone. Whatever had been watching them, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, was now coming for them. The darkness inside the crawlspace was absolute, swallowing up the faint light that seeped through the cracks in the floorboards above. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the scraping sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the walls and amplifying the terror that gripped him. His friends were frozen beside him, their breaths coming in shallow, fearful gasps. The letters, the trinkets, they were forgotten now, their discovery overshadowed by the realization that something was in the crawlspace with them. Jake scrambled to find the flashlight, his fingers brushing against the cold metal just as the beam flickered back to life. The narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the source of the sound. In the far corner of the crawlspace, the dirt was shifting, as if something was crawling up from beneath the earth. The sight sent a jolt of pure fear through Jake, but he forced himself to stay focused, to stay in control. He motioned to Mark and Sam, his voice barely a whisper as he told them to move back, to get out of the crawlspace as quickly as possible. The two boys didn't need to be told twice. They backed away slowly, their eyes wide with terror as the sound of movement grew more frantic. Whatever was in the earth, it was struggling to break free. Jake followed closely behind them, his flashlight trained on the shifting dirt. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get out while he still could. But he couldn't leave without making sure his friends were safe. The three of them crawled toward the opening, their movements clumsy in their panic. Just as Mark reached the door, the ground behind them erupted. The figure that had been buried beneath the dirt emerged, its form twisting and contorting as it pulled itself free. Jake only caught a glimpse, a flash of pale, rotting skin, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light, before he pushed Mark through the door and scrambled out after him. The three boys tumbled into the cabin, slamming the crawlspace door shut behind them. The noise was deafening, the heavy thud of the wood reverberating through the room. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing, the reality of what they had just seen slowly sinking in. But the silence didn't last long. The scratching returned, now furious and relentless, as if the creature was trying to claw its way through the floorboards. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the stench of decay. Jake's mind raced. There was no time to think, no time to plan. They had to get out. With a shout, he grabbed his friends and headed for the door. The cabin, once a place of safety, was now a prison. The darkness outside was less terrifying than what was inside, and they burst through the door, stumbling into the night. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the clearing, their lungs burning, their legs weak from the adrenaline. The cabin loomed behind them, dark and silent once more, but they knew the creature was still inside, waiting. Jake looked back, the fear still gripping him, but there was also a sense of grim determination. They had survived, but only just. The letters, the stories his grandfather had written, they were proof that the terror wasn't new, that it had been waiting in that cabin for years. And now they had woken it. The three boys didn't return to the cabin. They didn't even go back for their belongings. They walked through the night, through the dark woods that now felt safer than the place they had left behind. The sun was rising by the time they reached the nearest town, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces pale with fear. They didn't speak of what had happened, not to each other, not to anyone else. The terror of that night was something they carried with them in silence, a shared nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as for the cabin, it remained in the woods, silent and waiting. A place where shadows moved on their own, where the past refused to stay buried. A place where something dark and malevolent lurked beneath the floorboards, ready to rise again. Beach vacation turns into skinwalker nightmare. The ocean breeze carried with it the scent of salt water and freshly caught fish as Emily and her son, Oliver, arrived in the quaint town of St. Ives. It was a beautiful seaside village, its cobbled streets lined with small shops, cozy cafes, and pastel-colored cottages overlooking the water. The crashing waves of the Atlantic were a soothing backdrop, and Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her as they stepped out of the car. This was exactly what they needed, time away from the city, away from the stress. Oliver, a curious and adventurous 10-year-old, had always been fascinated by the ocean. He immediately ran down to the beach, his feet sinking into the soft sand as he marveled at the vast expanse of water before him. Emily smiled, watching him, thankful for the opportunity to give him this experience. They had rented a small cottage at the edge of town, just a short walk from the beach. It was a charming little place, built with weathered stone and old wooden beams that creaked with every step. Inside, it was cozy, with mismatched furniture and the lingering smell of the sea in the air. The locals had assured Emily that this was the best spot to relax and enjoy the tranquility of the ocean. But as the day wore on and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, a sense of unease began to creep in. The light took on a strange, orange hue, and the streets, once bustling with tourists and locals, grew eerily quiet. Emily noticed the change but dismissed it as the usual stillness that came with the evening. Later that night, as she tucked Oliver into bed, the wind began to pick up, howling against the walls of the cottage. The shutters rattled in their frames, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the storm outside. It wasn't unusual for storms to roll in quickly from the Atlantic, but there was something about this one that made Emily uneasy. It felt unnatural, as if the wind carried with it a warning. Unable to shake the feeling, Emily sat up in bed, listening to the wind whip around the house. That's when she heard it, a faint, distant sound, almost like a voice. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her, but as she strained to listen, the sound became clearer. It was a low, guttural moan, unlike anything she had ever heard before. She rose from the bed and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The wind was strong, the waves crashing violently against the shore, but there was no one in sight. Yet, the sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the wind, it was something else, something out there in the storm, watching. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, cloudless sky. The town of St. Ives looked picturesque again, as if the previous night's unease had been nothing more than a bad dream. Emily shook off the lingering fear from the strange noises and got ready for the day. After all, this trip was meant to be relaxing, and she wasn't about to let her imagination ruin that. Oliver, oblivious to his mother's discomfort, was eager to explore. He pleaded with her to let him go down to the beach, and Emily reluctantly agreed, though she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. She decided to join him, keeping an eye on him as he dashed toward the water. The beach was unusually empty for a sunny morning. Only a few distant figures walked along the shoreline, their heads down, as if they were too focused to notice anything around them. The sea was calm now, the waves gently lapping at the sand, but the air felt heavy, too still for a day by the coast. As Emily sat on a bench near the shore, watching Oliver splash in the shallow water, her attention was drawn to an old man sitting a few yards away. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and weathered, almost blending in with the rocks behind him. There was something unsettling about him, something in the way he sat, staring blankly at the horizon. Emily couldn't tell if he had even noticed her, but she felt a chill run down her spine as his head slowly turned in her direction. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on Oliver. But the sensation of being watched didn't fade. She glanced back at the old man, but he was gone, disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there. Emily's heart raced, her unease returning in full force. Trying to shake off the encounter, she called Oliver back from the water, telling him it was time to head back to the cottage. As they walked up the beach, Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the old man to reappear. But the beach remained empty, and the strange stillness persisted. Later that day, as they wandered through the narrow streets of St. Ives, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the old man. She asked one of the shopkeepers if anyone around town matched the description of the man she had seen, but the woman behind the counter gave her a confused look. "No one like that around here," the woman said with a shrug. "Maybe just one of the drifters passing through, but I haven't seen anyone like that recently." Emily nodded, but the shopkeeper's response didn't ease her worries. There was something strange about this town, something that she couldn't explain. The locals seemed friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent of unease in their smiles, as if they were all keeping a secret. As the day came to a close, the sense of dread that had plagued her the night before returned. Emily could no longer deny that something was off in St. Ives. She only hoped she was imagining it, that the strange storm, the old man on the beach, the eerie quietness were all just coincidences. But deep down, she knew something more sinister was at play. That night, the wind returned, though not with the same intensity as before. It was calmer but more insistent, like a whisper sliding through the cracks of the old cottage. Emily had just finished putting Oliver to bed when the strange feeling crept over her again, that feeling that they were not alone. She tried to convince herself that it was just nerves. The unsettling events of the past 2 days had left her on edge, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Every shadow seemed longer, every creak of the floorboards louder. As she sat in the living room, attempting to read a book, the wind outside seemed to carry that same moaning sound she had heard the night before, distant but unmistakable. Suddenly, a loud knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart raced as she approached the door cautiously. Peering through the small window, she saw no one. Emily hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The street outside was empty, the town quiet and still, just as it had been earlier. Her eyes drifted to the beach in the distance, where the waves lapped gently at the shore under the pale moonlight. And there, standing at the edge of the water, was a figure. It wasn't the old man from earlier. No, this figure was taller, hunched over, its movements slow and unnatural. For a moment, it appeared human, but there was something wrong, something off about the way it moved. Emily blinked, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. She called for Oliver, her voice hushed but urgent. He quickly joined her at the door, and together they stared at the strange figure by the beach. "Is that a person?" Oliver asked, his voice a nervous whisper. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her eyes fixed on the figure, which was now slowly turning its head toward them. Without thinking, she pulled Oliver inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. But there was no logic to it, only fear. As she stepped away from the door, a sudden noise from the back of the cottage made her freeze. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone, or something, was circling the house. Emily grabbed Oliver's hand, her heart pounding in her chest as they backed away from the door, their eyes darting around the room. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, moving around the house, growing closer to the front door. It was then that Emily remembered the stories she had heard as a child, stories of skinwalkers, creatures that could take on the form of humans or animals, beings of ancient legend that brought terror wherever they went. She hadn't believed those stories back then, brushing them off as myths. But now, standing in the cottage with her son, hearing the footsteps of something that shouldn't exist, she couldn't help but wonder if the stories were real. As the footsteps stopped outside the door, Emily held her breath. She heard a faint scratching sound, as if something sharp was being dragged across the wood. And then, through the crack in the door, she saw it, the figure from the beach, now standing just feet away, its face twisted into an unnatural, almost grotesque imitation of a human smile. Her blood ran cold as the figure slowly raised its hand, its fingers long and clawed, and knocked once more. Emily stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, clutching Oliver's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the same eerie scratching sound. The figure outside the door lingered, its shadow stretching through the narrow window, casting long, twisted shapes on the floor of the cottage. Her mind raced. She knew she had to do something, but fear kept her rooted to the spot. She didn't want to open the door, but she knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The figure, whatever it was, would find its way in eventually. Oliver whispered, "Mom, what is that?" His voice trembled with fear. Emily didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they needed to get out. She pulled Oliver away from the door, heading toward the back of the cottage. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with the lock on the back door. But just as she turned the handle, she heard the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. A cold wave of terror washed over her. The door hadn't been locked properly. She turned around slowly, her eyes wide with fear, and saw the figure standing in the doorway. Its face was even more distorted up close, the skin stretched tight over a skull-like frame, its eyes dark and hollow. It didn't move, only stood there, watching them with an unnatural stillness that made Emily's skin crawl. Without thinking, Emily pushed Oliver behind her, her instincts kicking in to protect her son at all costs. The figure finally stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised its head, sniffing the air like a predator catching the scent of prey. She needed to act. Now. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her gaze landed on an iron fireplace poker leaning against the wall near the hearth. Without hesitating, she lunged for it, gripping the cold metal tightly in her hands. The creature moved toward her, its twisted smile widening. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. But she stood her ground, raising the poker in front of her like a shield. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shaky but firm. The creature paused, tilting its head as if studying her, as if it found her fear amusing. It took another step forward, and then another, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. Emily's grip tightened on the poker. She didn't know if it would do any good, but she had no other choice. As the creature lunged toward her, she swung the poker with all her strength, striking it across the chest. The creature let out a guttural screech, stumbling backward. It wasn't wounded, but the blow had startled it, buying Emily and Oliver precious time. She grabbed Oliver's hand, pulling him toward the back door. Together, they bolted outside into the cold night air. They ran as fast as they could, the wind whipping around them as they headed for the safety of the town. Behind them, the creature's screeches echoed through the night, but Emily didn't dare look back. She didn't know if they were being chased or if the creature had given up, but she wasn't about to find out. They didn't stop running until they reached the town square, breathless and shaking. The streets were empty, the town quiet and peaceful, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But Emily knew better. She had seen the creature with her own eyes. She had faced the terror that had been stalking them. And now, the once quaint town of St. Ives would never feel safe again. 1983, the paranormal Halloween that haunted a town. In October of 1983, Harper's Ridge was like any other small American town, preparing for its annual Halloween celebration. The air was crisp, the trees had shed most of their leaves, and the streets were adorned with carved pumpkins and makeshift decorations. The town's children eagerly awaited the festivities, while parents planned a traditional block party that had been a staple of the town for decades. Jenny Crawford, a 16-year-old high school student, was excited for the night. She and her friends had spent weeks planning their costumes and talking about the local haunted house, an old, abandoned mansion at the edge of town that no one had entered in years. Rumors had always swirled around the mansion, tales of eerie sounds and shadowy figures seen from its broken windows, but no one really believed them. The stories were just that, stories meant to scare the younger kids. That year, however, the mansion felt different. There was something about the way it loomed at the edge of the town, its windows like dark, soulless eyes watching everything. People began to whisper that the mansion was awakening after decades of silence. Still, the excitement of Halloween overpowered any sense of unease. The night of October 31st arrived, and the town was alive with the buzz of children in costumes running through the streets, collecting candy and laughing. The town's block party was in full swing, with music, laughter, and the smell of freshly baked treats filling the air. It seemed like the perfect Halloween night, until the sun began to set. As darkness fell over Harper's Ridge, an unnatural fog rolled in from the woods. It was thick and dense, quickly engulfing the streets and shrouding the entire town in an eerie, almost suffocating mist. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the festive atmosphere began to shift. The laughter of children faded into uneasy silence, and even the streetlights seemed dimmer, their orange glow barely penetrating the fog. Jenny, along with her friends Mike and Lisa, stood at the edge of the block party, watching as the fog crept toward them. They had planned to head to the mansion that night, to prove once and for all that the stories were nothing but harmless local legends. But as the fog thickened and a strange, cold wind began to swirl around them, Jenny felt the first pangs of doubt. Something was wrong, and for the first time, she wasn't sure they should go through with their plan. Despite the unsettling fog and the chill in the air, Jenny, Mike, and Lisa pressed on with their plan. The excitement of exploring the old mansion was too strong to resist, and they convinced themselves that the strange atmosphere was just a coincidence. After all, it was Halloween, and a little fear only added to the thrill. With flashlights in hand, they made their way through the dense fog toward the mansion. The towering structure loomed ahead of them, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist. As they approached, the house seemed even more ominous than before, its decaying exterior covered in creeping vines, the windows dark and unwelcoming. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking on its rusted hinges, as if inviting them inside. The three teenagers hesitated for a moment at the entrance, their bravado wavering as they stared into the pitch-black interior of the mansion. The fog pressed against their backs, almost as if urging them forward, and finally, Jenny took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air inside the mansion was stale and cold, carrying the smell of rot and decay. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling and curling at the edges, and the furniture, covered in thick layers of dust, sat eerily untouched as if frozen in time. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, a strange feeling washed over Jenny. It wasn't just the usual unease of being in a dark, abandoned place, this felt more like being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing behind them. but there was nothing. Mike, trying to lighten the mood, cracked a joke about the place being haunted, but his voice sounded hollow, as if the mansion was absorbing the sound. Lisa didn't laugh. She was staring at the staircase ahead of them, her face pale. At the top of the stairs, barely visible in the faint light of their flashlights, was a shadow. It was tall and human-like, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for them to notice. Jenny froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared at the figure. She blinked, and the shadow seemed to dissolve into the darkness. Mike whispered, asking if they had seen it too, but none of them moved. The mansion, once just a crumbling old building, now felt alive, like it had been waiting for them to arrive. The silence inside the mansion grew heavier as they stood frozen at the base of the staircase. None of them spoke, but the tension between them was palpable. Jenny's mind raced, trying to make sense of the shadow she had seen at the top of the stairs. It couldn't have been real, just a trick of the light, she told herself. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. Mike, always the most daring of the group, broke the silence first. He suggested they head upstairs, brushing off the eerie shadow as nothing more than their imagination. Reluctantly, Jenny and Lisa agreed. With each creaking step they took, the air seemed to grow colder, the oppressive feeling of being watched intensifying. As they reached the second floor, the hallway stretched out before them, lined with closed doors. The walls were cracked, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The atmosphere felt thick, almost suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, aware of their presence. Suddenly, one of the doors at the far end of the hallway creaked open on its own. The sound echoed through the mansion, sending chills down their spines. Jenny's stomach tightened with dread as a soft, distant whisper followed, drifting through the air like a ghostly echo. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was sinister and unsettling. Lisa clutched Jenny's arm, her fear evident in her wide eyes. Every instinct told them to leave, to turn around and run, but something kept them rooted to the spot. Before they could act, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, the loud bang reverberating through the house. The wind outside howled, rattling the broken windows, and the light from their flashlights flickered wildly. Panic set in. The air around them felt thick, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Jenny's heart raced, and her mind screamed for them to get out, to run as fast as they could. But something rooted them in place, fear, confusion, or maybe the malevolent force that had claimed the mansion all those years ago. Then, from the dark corners of the hallway, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. They were no longer alone. The presence they had felt since entering the mansion had awakened, and it was moving toward them. Jenny's body went cold. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were just inches away. She glanced at Mike and Lisa, their faces mirroring her own terror. They had come looking for a thrill, but what they found was something far darker, something they couldn't outrun. The footsteps grew louder, each one slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway like the ticking of a clock. The darkness pressed in around them, swallowing the narrow beams of their flashlights. Jenny's body felt numb with fear, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't see what was coming toward them, but she knew it was there, an unseen presence that had been lying dormant in the mansion for decades, now awakened by their intrusion. Without warning, a freezing gust of air swept through the hallway, extinguishing their flashlights completely. Jenny's breath caught in her throat as the darkness enveloped them. She could hear Mike and Lisa breathing heavily beside her, their fear as palpable as her own. The sound of the footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the darkness, Jenny felt a cold hand brush against her arm. She recoiled in terror, her pulse spiking as she instinctively reached out for Mike and Lisa. But before she could react, a low, guttural growl echoed through the hallway, sending a wave of panic through the group. Mike, always the bravest, finally broke the paralysis that had gripped them. He grabbed Jenny's hand, pulling her back toward the staircase. Lisa followed closely behind, their footsteps frantic as they raced down the stairs, the oppressive darkness chasing them. The house seemed to groan and creak around them, the walls trembling as if the very structure was alive, reacting to their fear. They burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. The fog that had rolled in earlier still hung thick in the air, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating atmosphere inside the mansion. Without looking back, they ran, their feet pounding the dirt path that led away from the house, the growl still echoing in their ears. By the time they reached the edge of the town, the mansion had disappeared into the fog, its dark silhouette swallowed by the mist. Breathless and trembling, they collapsed on the ground, unable to speak. The haunting silence of Harper's Ridge surrounded them once more, but now, they knew the truth. The mansion was not just an old, decaying building. It was a living, breathing entity, and they had disturbed its slumber. Years later, the events of that night would remain a mystery to those who didn't witness it. But for Jenny, Mike, and Lisa, Harper's Ridge would forever be a place of nightmares, a town where Halloween would never again be just a harmless celebration. The mansion still stands, its shadow looming over the town, waiting for its next visitors. What lurks in the shadows of their great-grandmother's farm? Sarah and Lucas were used to the lights and noise of Manhattan, but the silence of the countryside was a welcome change. The vast fields that surrounded their great-grandmother's farm were dotted with cattle, and the open sky stretched endlessly, untainted by city lights. The twins quickly fell into the rhythm of farm life, spending their days exploring the land and helping with chores. Their great-grandmother, Donna Helena, was kind and full of stories from a life well lived. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on that first night, a shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Dinner had been simple, vegetables from the farm, freshly baked bread, and laughter. However, as the night grew darker, Donna Helena's tone changed. She sat the twins down in the small, dimly lit living room and began recounting the legends that surrounded her farm. Stories of strange apparitions, shadowy figures that wandered the fields, and strange voices carried on the wind. These were tales she had grown up hearing, but now she spoke of them with the weight of personal experience. The twins, initially entertained by the old stories, soon felt the room grow colder. Sarah shivered as her great-grandmother described a particular spirit, one that was said to roam the outskirts of the farm. It was no longer just a ghost story to them. There was something unsettling about the way Donna Helena spoke, as if she truly believed in what she was saying. Lucas, always the skeptic, tried to brush it off, laughing nervously and saying it was just their great-grandmother's way of spooking them. But Sarah could see it in his eyes. He was afraid too. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and even the usually comforting sounds of the countryside, the distant hum of crickets and the rustling of the wind, seemed eerie. That night, they settled into the hammocks on the porch, too uneasy to sleep inside the house. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the farm. As they swayed gently in the hammocks, the twins tried to shake off the fear that had taken root. But just as they began to drift off, something changed. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and the faint rustling of the wind turned into something more sinister. As the cool night air settled over them, Sarah and Lucas swayed gently in their hammocks, trying to calm their racing hearts. But the stillness of the night felt wrong. The warmth of the day had vanished, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seeped into their bones. Sarah, half awake, pulled the thin blanket tighter around her, but it did little to shield her from the creeping sense of dread that was starting to take hold. The wind, once a gentle breeze, now felt heavy. It carried with it an unnatural presence, as though something unseen was moving through it. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his hammock, his earlier bravado now completely gone. He could feel it too, the overwhelming sensation that they weren't alone. Then, without warning, the faint sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of animals, were swallowed by an eerie silence. The kind of silence that makes every hair on your body stand on end. It was suffocating, like the world had stopped moving altogether. And in that silence, both Sarah and Lucas began to feel it. It started as a faint pressure, a weight that seemed to settle over their bodies, pressing down on them from all sides. At first, Sarah thought she was imagining it. But when she tried to move, her body refused to respond. Panic set in as the invisible weight grew heavier, making it hard to breathe. She struggled, her chest tightening with fear, but no matter how hard she tried, her limbs wouldn't obey. Lucas felt it too. His muscles tensed, his mind racing as he tried to break free from the unseen force that seemed to bind him to the hammock. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of his own heartbeat the only thing he could hear. Desperately, he tried to call out to Sarah, to see if she was experiencing the same thing, but his voice was caught in his throat, strangled by the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. It was as though the very shadows had come alive, blanketing them in a suffocating embrace. The cold intensified, biting at their skin, and with it came a sense of pure, unrelenting terror. It felt like they were being watched, no, hunted, by something unseen, something ancient and malevolent. Sarah's mind raced. She remembered the stories her great-grandmother had told, the tales of spirits and dark forces that roamed the farm at night. She had dismissed them as just that, stories. But now, with the crushing weight of fear pressing down on her, those stories felt all too real. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The cold receded, and the night sounds returned, as though nothing had happened at all. Sarah and Lucas lay in their hammocks, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking with the aftershock of what they had just experienced. They exchanged terrified glances, their earlier skepticism gone. Something dark was lurking on the farm, and they had only just begun to uncover it. The next morning, the sunlight did little to erase the terror of the previous night. Sarah and Lucas woke up with heavy eyes, their bodies aching from the restless night spent in their hammocks. The events of the night before lingered in their minds like a bad dream, but they both knew it had been all too real. Neither of them spoke of what had happened as they ate breakfast with their great-grandmother, but the tension between them was thick, unspoken. Donna Helena, seemingly unaware of their unease, went about her usual routine, humming softly to herself as she prepared food in the kitchen. She looked every bit the loving great-grandmother, but now there was something unsettling about her calmness. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Donna Helena knew more about what had happened during the night than she let on. There was a weight in her eyes, as though she had seen things in her long life that she chose not to speak about. As the day wore on, the twins stayed close to the farmhouse. The fields that had seemed so inviting the day before now felt ominous, almost threatening. The shadows cast by the tall trees lining the property seemed darker, more alive, and every gust of wind felt like it carried whispers with it. Sarah couldn't stop replaying the night in her head, the sensation of being paralyzed by an unseen force, the crushing weight that had pressed down on her. And worse, the feeling of something watching them from the darkness, waiting for its moment to strike. By late afternoon, Lucas finally broke the silence. They had to know what was happening. There was no use pretending they hadn't experienced something terrifying. He suggested they ask their great-grandmother directly about the stories she had told them the night before, about the spirits that haunted the farm. They found Donna Helena outside, tending to her small garden, her hands working methodically through the plants. She looked up as they approached, a small smile playing on her lips, but there was a guarded look in her eyes. Lucas, unable to hold back any longer, asked about the spirits, about whether they were real, and about the strange events of the previous night. For a moment, Donna Helena was silent, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where the setting sun cast an orange glow over the land. Then, in a quiet voice, she began to speak. The farm, she said, had always been a place of life and death, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had always been thin. There were things here, she told them, that could not be explained, forces that had existed long before she or even her parents had been born. The twins stood frozen as she spoke, their fears confirmed. There was something on the farm, something beyond their understanding, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. That night, an eerie stillness settled over the farm. The wind, which had gusted gently throughout the day, had completely died. Even the crickets, which usually sang their nightly chorus, were silent. Sarah and Lucas lay in their hammocks once again, staring at the stars above. Despite the calmness around them, the sense of dread from the previous night lingered heavily in the air. Donna Helena had said little after their conversation, retreating to her room early with a quiet warning that they should lock the doors and windows. But the twins had chosen to sleep outside again, hoping to shake the fear that had haunted them since their arrival. Yet as they lay there, trying to relax, the oppressive feeling of being watched returned. This time, the darkness seemed thicker, as though it were alive and pressing in on them from all sides. Sarah was the first to notice the change. Her skin prickled with cold as she sensed something moving in the shadows, just beyond the flickering light of the porch. She sat up slowly, scanning the yard, her heart pounding in her chest. Lucas noticed her movement and whispered for her to stay calm, but the words barely reached her ears. The feeling of being suffocated by an unseen presence returned, stronger and more intense than the night before. Sarah felt as though the very air around her was growing denser, colder, as if something was drawing closer. Suddenly, from the far end of the yard, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It moved unnaturally, gliding rather than walking, and though its form was human-like, there was something deeply wrong about it. Its head was twisted at an odd angle, and its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural motions as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. Panic surged through Sarah, and she gasped, grabbing onto the edge of her hammock. The shadow paused, as if it had heard her, and slowly turned its head toward the twins. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto them with an intensity that made Sarah's blood run cold. The temperature plummeted even further, and a deep, unnatural fog began to creep across the ground, curling around the hammocks like fingers reaching for them. The sensation of being trapped, of something wrapping itself around their bodies, was overwhelming. Lucas struggled to move, but just like before, his body refused to respond. They were paralyzed, helpless as the dark entity closed in. The fog grew thicker, and with it came a low, guttural sound, a growl that seemed to reverberate from the very earth itself. It was a sound that was neither human nor animal, something ancient and terrifying, echoing through the night. As the figure came closer, the growl intensified, vibrating through their bodies, filling them with dread. Just when it seemed like the entity would reach them, something broke the spell. The distant toll of a church bell echoed through the night, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The shadow stopped, hesitated for a moment, then slowly faded back into the fog, disappearing into the night. The oppressive weight lifted, and Sarah and Lucas could move again. They didn't wait. Scrambling out of their hammocks, they ran into the house, slamming the door behind them. Breathless and shaking, they collapsed on the floor, too terrified to speak. The farm had fallen silent once more, but they knew now what lay beyond the light of the porch. The dark presence wasn't gone, it was just waiting. A clown in the shadows, a walk home gone wrong. Ethan had missed the last bus by just a few minutes. The sun had already dipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised shade of purple. As he walked, the once bustling streets of Sudbury were now empty, devoid of any signs of life. The silence was unnerving. A few blocks in, the first strange thing happened, a sudden call from a crow, followed by another. Ethan looked up, but there was no bird in sight, just the wind rustling the bare branches above. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if something was watching him. He picked up his pace, hoping to make it home before darkness fully descended. But as he rounded a corner, his vision blurred, the world around him flickering like an old, broken TV screen. He stopped, blinking rapidly, but for a moment, it felt like reality had shifted. Ethan shook his head, trying to clear the strange sensation, but the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. The street ahead of him stretched endlessly, far longer than he remembered. His steps felt heavy, as though the ground beneath him was pulling him down. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting someone to appear, but there was only the endless stretch of silent, empty road behind him. Suddenly, his surroundings flickered again, as though someone had hit a reset button on reality. For a split second, everything went dark, and then, just as quickly, it returned to normal. Or at least, it seemed normal. But something felt off, like he wasn't alone anymore. The oppressive quiet returned, broken only by the distant caw of a crow that still seemed nowhere to be seen. Ethan's heart raced as he continued to walk, feeling as if the street was pulling him deeper into something unknown. As Ethan walked further, the houses on either side of the street seemed to blur, their details fading into the growing darkness. His steps quickened, but no matter how fast he moved, the distance home felt infinite. His breathing grew ragged, and just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw something ahead, a figure standing at the end of the street. The figure was still, almost unnaturally so, and from the faint light of a distant street lamp, Ethan could make out the outline of a person. As he got closer, his stomach twisted with dread. The figure wore brightly colored clothes, like a clown. But something about it was horribly wrong. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its posture stiff. Ethan froze in place. The street around him was dead silent, but the figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. He didn't know what it was, but his gut told him to run. Ethan stood frozen, his eyes locked on the strange figure at the end of the street. As he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, his vision blurred again, and for a split second, the world around him flickered like a broken TV screen. The figure, once still, seemed to twitch, its head jerking unnaturally from side to side. Fear gripped Ethan's chest as the figure's face slowly became visible. Beneath the makeup and the clown's costume, there was something else, something inhuman. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sinister red gleam cutting through the dark. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the low, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the figure itself. It wasn't a person. As realization dawned, the figure suddenly took a step forward. The movement was stiff, like it was being controlled by something unnatural. Ethan's legs refused to move, but his mind screamed at him to run. Whatever it was getting closer. The man in the black suit, trapped in a dark dimension. In the summer of 1993, 3 young scouts, Oscar, Ingrid, and Henrik, embarked on a weekend camping trip with their troop near the Sogndalsfjord in Norway. It was a typical scouting adventure, filled with hiking, knot tying, and exploring the deep forests that bordered the river. As the group traveled deeper into the woods, the trio lagged behind, distracted by the beauty of the towering trees and the distant sound of the rushing water. After walking for what felt like hours, the trail they had been following disappeared, swallowed by the thick underbrush. Realizing they were separated from their troop, Oscar suggested they keep moving, hoping to catch up. However, the forest only seemed to grow darker and more ominous with each step. Panic began to creep into their minds as the sun started to set behind the mountains. Just as they began to consider turning back, a small, secluded cabin appeared in the distance near the river's edge. Thin curls of smoke rose from the chimney, and a faint light flickered from within. Relief washed over them, they had found help. As the 3 scouts approached the cabin, they noticed an old man sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, watching the river as it flowed past. He wore a black suit, faded and worn, and his expression was calm, almost too calm. Oscar led the group, calling out for help, but the man didn't respond immediately. He simply continued to rock back and forth, his eyes fixed on the water. When they were close enough, the man finally acknowledged them with a slow nod, motioning them to come closer. His movements were deliberate, unsettlingly slow. Ingrid hesitated, her instincts screaming that something wasn't right, but Oscar, eager to find their way back, stepped forward. The man gestured toward the cabin door, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be offering them shelter, and perhaps a map to help them find their troop. Ingrid and Henrik exchanged uneasy glances but followed Oscar as he led the way inside. The door creaked open, and the 3 stepped into the dimly lit interior, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. Once inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The small, cozy structure they expected seemed to expand before their eyes. The walls stretched out impossibly far, and the rooms twisted in ways that defied logic. A deep, unsettling cold settled over the group, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Shadows moved in the corners of their vision, flickering in and out as if the cabin itself were alive. Oscar, Ingrid, and Henrik tried to stay close to each other, but the hallway stretched on endlessly. Every door they passed was locked, and the furniture seemed aged and out of place, like relics from a forgotten time. The floor creaked under their feet, and strange, low whispers echoed from the walls, though none of them could understand the words. Suddenly, they saw the old man again, standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes were darker now, almost empty. He didn't speak, but his presence alone filled them with dread. The realization hit them: this wasn't just a cabin. It was something much darker, a trap they had unknowingly walked into. Panic surged through the trio as the walls seemed to close in around them. The cabin's interior had become a nightmarish maze, with no clear way out. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, as if the cabin itself was feeding off their fear. Desperation took over, and they sprinted down the endless hallway, hoping to find an exit. Just as they thought they were trapped for good, Henrik spotted something, a map pinned to the wall, old and yellowed with age. It seemed to show a way out, a path leading back to the river. Oscar grabbed it, and the instant he tore it from the wall, the cabin began to shake violently. The door they had entered through suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway. Without looking back, they ran as fast as they could. The floor trembled beneath their feet, and the air was thick with the sound of cracking wood. They burst through the door, tumbling out into the dark forest, gasping for breath. When they turned around, the cabin was gone. Nothing but the sound of the river remained. They had escaped, but the memory of the man in the black suit and the horrors within the cabin would haunt them forever. Escape the fire-eyed beast. Deep in the heart of Krubra Cave, the world's deepest cave system in Abkhazia, a group of 5 thrill-seeking hikers set out on a daring adventure. The cave, known for its vast, dark tunnels, was both a wonder and a mystery. No one expected to find anything more than the usual underground wonders: rock formations, deep pits, and endless darkness. But as they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon something that didn't belong. A cabin, impossibly located miles below the Earth's surface, stood in the shadows of the cave, defying all logic. The group's curiosity led them inside, but what awaited them was far worse than the darkness they had imagined. The air inside Krubra Cave was heavy with moisture, and the only sounds were the dripping of water and the distant echoes of their footsteps. After hours of navigating the winding passages, the group stumbled upon something unexpected: a small, weathered cabin nestled in a secluded pocket of the cave. The sight of it sent a wave of unease through the group. Who could have built a cabin so deep underground? And why? Despite their growing apprehension, they decided to investigate. The door creaked open easily, revealing a dimly lit interior that looked untouched by time. As they stepped inside, an overwhelming pressure filled the room, and their hearts pounded painfully in their chests. It felt as though invisible hands were crushing them, squeezing the life from their bodies. Gasping for air, they collapsed into the old, dusty chairs that surrounded a table, trying to catch their breath. As the group sat in the cabin, trying to recover from the crushing sensation, a strange and unsettling noise filled the air. It started as a low, deep hum, but quickly escalated into a bone-chilling groan. The walls of the cabin seemed to tremble with the sound, as though something ancient and evil was awakening. The air grew colder, and an unshakable feeling of dread washed over them. Suddenly, one of them glanced out the small, fogged window, and there it was, a monstrous figure standing just beyond the cabin. Its eyes burned with an unnatural, fiery glow, illuminating the darkness of the cave. The creature's hulking form was twisted, otherworldly, as if it didn't belong in their world. And then it spoke. The voice was guttural, like the grinding of stone, and though the words were clear, their meaning was terrifying. It repeated over and over, a warning, a curse: you should not be here. The group froze, paralyzed by the sight of the creature. The feeling of being trapped, both physically and mentally, was suffocating, and fear tightened its grip on their hearts. The monster's fiery eyes burned through the window, its voice a terrifying chant that echoed in their minds. Panic set in as the group realized they had made a fatal mistake. The cabin, the creature, none of it should exist, yet here they were, trapped miles beneath the earth with no hope of escape. The pressure in the room grew stronger, suffocating them again, as though the air itself was turning against them. One of the hikers, Mark, bolted for the door, but as soon as he stepped outside, the creature lunged forward, its massive claws slashing through the air. The rest of the group could only watch in horror as Mark disappeared into the monster's grasp, dragged into the darkness beyond. His screams echoed through the cave, and then there was silence. The remaining hikers knew they had no chance against the creature. Their only hope lay in destroying the cabin. It was the source of the evil, the link that bound the monster to their world. Grabbing an old lantern, they frantically set the wooden structure on fire. Flames quickly engulfed the cabin, but as the inferno raged, the creature grew more violent, tearing at the walls with its fiery gaze. As the flames devoured the cabin, the group could feel the very ground beneath them tremble. The monster roared, its fiery eyes growing brighter, more enraged. The heat from the fire intensified, and the walls of the cabin began to crack and splinter. With every passing second, it felt like the air was being sucked out of the cave, and the group's chance of survival was slipping away. One by one, the remaining hikers tried to flee, but the creature was faster. It moved with an unnatural speed, pulling them into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the cave's cold, unforgiving darkness. Only one remained, Emma. Desperate and terrified, she grabbed the burning remains of the lantern and threw it at the creature. For a moment, it seemed to work. The monster recoiled, letting out a deafening roar as the flames licked its body. With what little strength she had left, Emma sprinted toward the cave's entrance, the map clutched tightly in her hand. As she crossed the threshold, the cabin behind her collapsed into ash, and the creature's roars faded into nothingness. Emma was the only one to survive, but the memory of the cabin and the monster would haunt her forever. Escape the man with no face. In the remote wilderness of Alaska, far from civilization, there is a cabin known only to those unfortunate enough to cross its path. Hidden deep within the forest, the cabin belongs to a man who was once normal, a man with a life, a family, and a future. But after a horrifying domestic accident that left his face grotesquely deformed, he became something else. Known only as the man with the broken face, he now roams the wilderness, capturing anyone who dares venture too close to his isolated home. Those who are caught are never seen again. Instead, they are taken to the underground bunker beneath the cabin, where they are forced to dig deeper into the earth, carving out a dark labyrinth of tunnels. The more they dig, the more they lose themselves to the terror that lurks in the shadows, driven mad by the horrors inflicted upon them by the man who controls their fate. The cabin stood alone in the wilderness, its dark silhouette blending into the dense forest. It was a place that most locals avoided, whispering stories about the man with the broken face. Few dared to wander too close, but every so often, a lost traveler or curious hiker would stumble upon the place, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. The man's face had been horrifically burned in a freak accident years ago, and the pain of that day had twisted his soul. He no longer saw himself as human, and anyone who crossed his path was dragged into his twisted world. With the remnants of his melted skin hanging loosely, he wore a mask made of wood and metal, hiding the deformity that marked him as a monster. Beneath the cabin was a labyrinth of tunnels, dark and cold, where the man's captives were forced to work. They dug endlessly, their hands bloodied and raw, their bodies weakened by exhaustion and fear. In the pitch-black darkness, they had no idea where they were or why they were digging, but they knew the man was always watching. His presence loomed over them, a constant reminder that escape was impossible. The bunker beneath the cabin was a suffocating maze of tunnels, carved out by the terrified hands of the captives. The walls dripped with moisture, the air thick with the stench of decay. No light penetrated the depths of this place, only the faint scraping of shovels and the ragged breathing of those forced to dig. The tunnels stretched on for what seemed like miles, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to tell where they were headed. Every so often, the man would descend into the depths to check on his captives. His footsteps echoed ominously in the narrow corridors, sending waves of panic through the already fragile minds of those trapped below. They knew that if he found them slacking, the consequences would be severe. Some had already suffered his wrath, disappearing into the darkness, never to be seen again. The man's deformed face remained hidden behind his crude mask, but his voice was low and guttural, filled with cruelty. He reveled in the fear he instilled, watching as his captives grew weaker with each passing day. For them, the darkness of the bunker wasn't just physical, it was mental, a slow descent into madness. For the captives, the darkness became a living thing. It whispered to them, taunted them, and twisted their thoughts into nightmares. Hours blended into days, and days months into weeks, with no sense of time or hope. The bunker became their world, a world of endless digging, pain, and fear. The man's presence was constant, even when he wasn't there. His footsteps, his voice, and his twisted face haunted their minds. Occasionally, they would hear the tortured screams of those who had been taken deeper into the tunnels, never to return. The captives knew that whatever lay in the farthest depths of the bunker was worse than anything they could imagine. But still, they dug. Their hands bled, their bodies weakened, and their minds slowly unraveled. Each night, they huddled together, trembling in the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. The man would come for one of them, dragging them deeper into the bunker, where the true terror began. Those who remained were left to wonder if they would be next, haunted by the knowledge that escape was impossible. The bunker, like the man, had no mercy. One by one, the captives began to break under the weight of their fear. The darkness, the endless digging, and the constant threat of the man with the broken face eroded their minds. But it wasn't just the physical torture that wore them down, it was the knowledge that they were trapped, with no hope of escape. They whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of the man's twisted game, but no answer ever came. Then, one night, the man descended into the bunker with a different kind of fury. His usual slow, methodical pace was replaced with frenzied steps as he prowled the tunnels, searching for his next victim. The captives could hear him coming, his breathing heavy and erratic, his rage palpable in the air. They huddled in the darkness, praying that they wouldn't be the one taken. When the man finally found his target, he didn't drag them away like before. This time, he unleashed the full extent of his wrath. Screams filled the bunker, echoing through the tunnels, as the man's twisted face contorted in a grotesque display of satisfaction. He had become more than just a killer, he was a monster, and the bunker was his domain. As the days stretched on, the bunker became a graveyard of lost souls. The few captives who remained could barely stand, their bodies gaunt, their eyes hollow. The darkness had taken everything from them, their strength, their hope, and their sanity. The man with the broken face had succeeded in reducing them to shells of who they once were, trapped in his nightmare. One of the last survivors, a young woman named Marta, knew that her time was running out. She had watched as everyone else was taken, dragged into the depths of the bunker, never to return. But she refused to go without a fight. In the dark, she had discovered a small crack in one of the tunnel walls. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. With trembling hands, she clawed at the crack, hoping it would lead to freedom. As the man descended once more, his twisted silhouette appearing in the distance, Marta knew it was now or never. She squeezed through the crack, scraping her skin against the cold stone, but she didn't stop. The sounds of his heavy footsteps grew closer, but she pushed on, disappearing into the darkness of the cave beyond. Behind her, the bunker fell silent. She was the only one who escaped. We've just explored 8 terrifying tales, each more chilling than the last. From the haunted cabin deep in the cave to the horrifying encounter with the man with no face, these stories will stay with you long after the video ends. But now, it's your turn. Tell us in the comments which story scared you the most and why. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all the spine-tingling stories we share here on Deep. We have plenty of other videos you might love, so feel free to explore the channel. There's always something waiting to give you chills. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones closest to home.